I'm Steve Smith, and welcome to the Lucky or Good podcast. This podcast invites reflection, curiosity, and dialogue following outdoor and experiential education incidents. Why do we normally succeed and sometimes fail? What can we learn from our successes, our near misses, or incidents? Through non judgmental analysis, we will uncover lessons for outdoor and experiential education programs. Rather than blaming and shaming, we ask different questions. What went well? How does your actions make sense to you at the time? And what can we learn from this for the future? We invite our listeners to imagine themselves in our guest's situation and to explore the sometimes fine line between lucky and good. I'm very excited to welcome and introduce today's guest, Norm Eckman, a longtime colleague, friend, and mentor to me from my early days as an outdoor educator, a person whom I've had the privilege of working with and learning from over several decades. Norm, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. I'm hoping we can just jump straight into the story and the concepts that you want to share with us today and go from there. So turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate being here, and thank you for sending a book. I read it, and it's very good. And I know I'm here to. You asked me to come on to the podcast to talk about incidences or what have you that I may have had, and the evaluations that took place. And as I was thinking about that, and my time with outdoor programs, I sort of looked at it from a different angle, as opposed to something physical, the risks of a physical incident in the field. And I was thinking of how I might want to present this. And as I evolved throughout my career, I was thinking, how did I evaluate a course? What made it a good course overall? And I'm speaking of outdoor adventure programming here. What made it a successful course? And as I thought about that in my earlier days, I recognized that I was defining the success of a course on things that actually were outside of my control. And that was the students' behaviors or the challenging behaviors that we might see on a course. So I asked myself, why am I evaluating a course from that perspective?
Hmm.
Things I didn't control. So I started asking also other instructors this. I would sit down and put up a flip chart and just ask them, what makes a successful course? What makes a course that when at the end of that course, what did you see? What did you do? What did the students do? Yeah, what made it a successful course from your perspective? And I would just list what they would put out there. And inevitably, it would focus on things like, well, the students got along, the students,
Mhm.
when they didn't get along, when they had conflict, they used the tools that we taught them throughout the course. They expressed how they grew throughout the program and their experience and so forth. And the vast majority of the list were things such as that. So the next question I would put out there would be, can we guarantee that every time on every course? Can we always have students who are going to be invested in the course, who are going to make positive choices throughout the course?
Mhm.
Or if they don't, they're going to work with the strategies that we get given them and so forth. And people would come around to the answer, well, no, we can't guarantee that by any means. And why not? Why can't we guarantee that we can have an effective, high quality, successful course? And the revelation of, and I think we all know this, is that we don't control other people's behaviors,
Mm.
right? I mean, if you controlled my behavior, I wouldn't be responsible for anything. You would be at fault, Steve, for anything I did. And that would be pretty nice, actually. But it doesn't work that way. You can't push a button. We can't push a button and have our students do what we want them to do. All we can do is control the aspects of a course that we are responsible for, which is in areas what I call the big four: structure, presence, supervision, involvement. All those are things that as an instructor, as an adult role model, as a teacher, as a mentor, we control on our courses. I think if we focus on that and we evaluate a course, the success of a course or the how successful a course is, then we're evaluating things that we're responsible for, we're accountable to, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing on courses is evaluating the structure throughout the course. What changes do we need to make? The presence, are we supervising? How much involvement are we? having with the students. So I felt, as I look back on things, as opposed to measuring the success of a course on what we don't control, measure the success of a course on what we're accountable for as professional instructors in the field. Because that's all you can really do. And I found too that when you do that, back in the day, there was you hear about burnout courses,
Mm.
right? The staff would come, man, I'm burnt, I'm fried. Well, why? Well, it was a challenging course behaviorally. We had a couple kids or this or that just weren't invested in the course and wanted to run their own program. And I felt I've been there. I felt that, and I believe it was because I was measuring the success of a course on things I didn't control.
Mm.
You know. Now, as I look back over the career I had, there are certainly some courses I can look back on and say, using this paradigm, weren't successful or as successful as I would have liked because I didn't manage the structure, presence, supervision, involvement as well as I could have with the skills I had at the time, the experience I had at the time, and so forth. So yeah, but then at the same time, I find that that burnout aspect, that burnout factor, can be much less when you're focusing on the success of a course on what you control,
Mm.
as opposed to allowing the students to dictate to you whether you had a good course or not. I don't know if that's making sense.
It makes a lot of sense, and I do remember learning this lesson from directly from you fairly early in my career and arising from some of those challenging
Yeah,
students that you and I had together,
yeah. I mean,
over the years.
think of the power you're handing over to students to dictate.
Mm.
And I think a lot of times, also as an instructor, you gain your self worth and your feel good factor about being a good instructor from the students' choices of behavior. And when you go through a course where things are rocking and everything was clicking and the students, maybe they weren't agreeing all the time or getting into having some behavioral issues, but they worked through those, you felt great. And I'm a good
Mm.
instructor.
Mm.
But even though throughout the course you may have attempted to make some changes and change and adjusted the structure and strategies to hopefully allow those students to make some more positive choices. If they didn't, then it's like you're measuring your own self worth as an instructor on things you don't control, aspects you don't.
Mhm.
And that, as I thought about it, didn't make sense to me.
Mhm.
You're a good instructor if you're focusing on what you're accountable for and responsible for in the field. Those aspects of structure, presence, supervision, involvement. Because once again, we don't control students. Now, what we do with our structure, presence, supervision, involvement influences the environment, influences their choices of behavior, but ultimately, they are responsible for their behavior as we are responsible for our behavior as instructors and teachers and whatnot. So as I read your book, that's what, and you talked about having me here on this podcast. That's what sort of struck out to me was that
Mhm.
evolution that took place for me over the years of how to evaluate a successful course. Later on, I wasn't evaluating a successful course so much on what the students controlled, but ultimately what I controlled and what myself and my co-instructor controlled. And that lessened the burnout factor quite a bit,
Mm. Mm.
when you did that.
And do you do you remember this evolution that occurred within you? Was that something that you sort of generated internally? Was that through studying work that other people were
Right.
doing? How did you kind of come to this realization?
Right. Well, my earlier career, I worked a lot with adults, but then I sort of morphed into working with youth
Mm.
and got involved quite a bit with the William Glasser's choice theory approach and aspects towards behavior. And he talks about why we do what we do and the influences around that, but ultimately that we all control our own behavior and
Mm.
nobody controls us, and it'd be nice if we could blame others for our choices of behavior, but it doesn't work that way. So why are we blaming ourselves that we had a bad course and feeling bad as an instructor on aspects that we don't control? Now, if you look back on if I look back on my course and I realized, you know what? Yeah, I was burnt. Maybe I didn't let my co-instructor know I was fried, so therefore I stepped back and didn't didn't get the break I needed, didn't recognize that I should have made some different choices at the time, or I can look back and say, I recognize I should have made some different choices at the time, but I chose not to. Yeah, then you're accountable for your choices. And maybe the course wasn't as successful as you would have liked it to be. But I'm not measuring it on the students' outcomes. I'm measuring it on what I did, which of course influences the students' choices. But if I did everything I could, there's nothing more you can ask of an instructor or anybody who's working in this field to do the best they can and work with the skills and knowledge that they have at the time. And then at the end of the course, assess that from that perspective. Because, yeah, you get back to that question and that list of what makes a successful course that instructors would throw out there and ask them, can you guarantee that every time? Well, no, you can't because it's out of our control in some
Mhm,
respects.
mhm.
When you get down to that level of behavior.
You brought up an interesting concept that resonates for me with something from the book. And you were talking about the extent to which we might fool ourselves into thinking that we're having a successful course just because the students aren't misbehaving and just because bad things aren't happening. But in that instance, perhaps we're still making the error of locating the definition of success in the student's behavior rather than in our
Mhm.
own actions. So where I'm going with that is the absence of student problems doesn't necessarily mean that we're running a successful course in the same way that the apparent absence of incidents doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing things safely, if
This
that makes
might
sense.
be because I was just lucky and not good, right? Structure
Mhm.
happens either intentionally or unintentionally.
Mm,
Usually, students have the opportunity to make better choices in a structure that's intentionally built as opposed to one that's just not even thought of. You go out on your course and things happen the way they happen. But you have the macro structure of the course, the itinerary, the activities throughout the course that you want to do, and the microstructure and those aspects of presence, supervision, involvement within that. Uh, I could tell within the first 5 minutes on the bus ride to the course start if I'm going to have some challenging students. And so I would sit in the bus next to those folks and start building that relationship. The micro aspect of presence, supervision, involvement is there. But
and you've mentioned those 4, elements a few times. Do you find that they're equally important for adult programs, or do you think they're more significant for the younger students, or how would you kind of compare that?
well, I think they're they're good for both. I mean,
Mhm,
you guys just adapt them to the age and the type of course and environment and so forth. I think you know, obviously it makes sense with younger students. The structure involves much more presence, much more supervision, much more involvement throughout the course. And of course, you can adjust that as the students pick up skills and strategies, and you assess their personal interactions and how well they're picking up their skills and step back and so forth. But certainly
mhm,
with youth, that aspect of present supervision involvement is going to be at a much higher level in most situations, not all, but in most situations when it comes to an adult group.
mhm,
You can give them a little bit more freedom from the and yeah, a little less presence than you might with a youth group.
mhm, mhm.
But those four
Yeah.
things are still there. Those four things are present in no matter what type of course you're
And I think that speaks to the sort of relationship-based approach, that I've seen you embody in your career, and I think it aligns as well with a lot of the concepts in the safety science book about the relationship between making a psychologically safe place for people and the effect that that can have on physical safety. And I'm wondering if that resonates with you or that interrelationship between psychological safety and physical safety. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
well, certainly if the environment, if the group culture is one where the trust isn't built up, the
Mm,
camaraderie, the teamwork isn't there, then the other aspects of the course can particularly potentially be more risky.
mhm.
I mean, I can think of courses I've had where you have to focusing on the behavioral challenges to the extent that you have to make a decision that, no, we can't climb this peak because we just aren't ready for it yet.
Mm.
I can think of those situations occurring. We have to work more on the relationship building, increase the presence and structure, supervision before we can move into the other aspects because the risk is much greater when those type of issues are present.
Yeah, no doubt, no
Yeah.
doubt. Were there any other kind of sections from the latest book that you think resonate with this evolution in your own thinking?
Well, when I was reading your book, just looking at it here again, something models that sort of fit with this was the new view of safety,
Hmm.
safety one, safety two. And I'm looking at it here, and I changed the wording a bit. But, safety one would state looking at measuring the success of a course from a perspective of what we control as instructors.
Mm.
A successful course is defined as the absence of injuries and incidents and students
Mm.
choosing positive behaviors. Safety two would state it. A successful course is defined as the presence of positive capacities and intentional instructor decision making. A safety one would state the goal of a successful course is for, let me see this, students to make positive choices of behavior. Safety two would state it, a goal of a successful course is for instructors to make intentional choices of course management.
Mm.
Safety one, inappropriate students are the cause of most unsuccessful courses. Safety two, instructors are intentional problem solvers and active innovators, which provide opportunities for students to make positive choices.
Mm.
That's the key to opportunities. We can't push the button and they make the positive choice. It's an opportunity. We set that opportunity up through the structure,
Mm.
presence, supervision, involvement. That's what we do. Safety one would state we must tell instructors what to do to have successful courses. Safety two would state it. We ask instructors what they need for a successful course.
Mm. Mhm.
This one didn't change at all. Deviation from policy or procedure is always a bad thing. Whereas safety two would state variability from normal operations can cause either positive or negative outcomes. I kept that one without changing any wording.
Mhm.
Safety one would state we should ask who failed. Did screening fail, or who was the why did we get this student or those students?
Yeah.
Safety two would state we should learn from what worked, what did not work,
Mm.
as instructors, teachers, in the field. Safety one, students' choices of dictate a successful or unsuccessful course. We must study what goes wrong to learn from failure. Safety two would state we should understand why things normally go right, to understand the conditions where performance variability can become difficult to understand and control. Instructors' choices of behavior dictate a successful and unsuccessful course. So once again, we're focusing on what we control to dictate the success or unsuccess
Hmm.
or unsuccessful course, as opposed to focusing on the students' behaviors. Yeah, we all love to have students all come to the end of the course and have this great experience and work through the issues with the skills we gave them throughout the course and so forth. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And if you're going to measure the success of a course by that, you're going to have a lot of days, I think, or
Mm.
potentially burnout moments when you're working with students or a student.
You were able to stay in your role for decades, with thousands of nights in the field with tens of thousands of students,
Yeah.
I would guess.
Yeah.
And you were able to evade burnout, perhaps through some of your own character and hard work and your personality, but also perhaps by adopting this belief that you're
Mhm.
going to define success by the things that are in your control rather than handing the reins of that completely over to something that's out of your control. So I'm curious, in the state of the outdoor industry, staffing is a challenge, getting people to do this work, and especially getting people to stay in these roles. Few people stay in these roles as long as you did. And I'm curious, like your thoughts on, well, two things. Maybe how would you imagine the impact of that turnover and that burnout and losing qualified people, and having to retrain people all the time, and the effect of that on an organization?
Well, certainly the more experience a program has in general, the smoother things run, the more effective the program is, and so forth and so on. So, yeah, if you don't have the burnout factor, which can turn people off from working courses, particularly, youth courses, that can be an issue. You would want to hopefully have people who are invested in it and and come to a realization, no matter how they look at to measure the success of a course, it works for them, so they can stay within and stay within.
So when you would facilitate that activity with the instructors and get them to look at the list that they came up with and point out to them that very little of this is in your control. I'm curious, did light bulbs go on? Was that well received? Do you have any stories about time that really was an epiphany for people?
Yeah, I think it was every time I would present this, it was an epiphany. It was interesting. It was like yeah, we don't control that stuff. If we did, we'd have a successful course every time. Where students are everything's great, and we could just make it happen every time. It's like, yeah, well, we can't because we don't control that aspect down at the nitty gritty. We don't control people. So that was seemed to be always quite an epiphany for folks. Now,
Mm.
some I think took it and ran with it. Others may not have as much, but it worked for me to a good extent, and I think it does for a lot of others also. Like I said, the burnout factor becomes less. And also, I found that if we're focusing on what we control, the big four, more of more opportunities are present and taken for students to make good choices when we're focusing on what we control, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, that's great.
You know,
I love what you did with safety one and safety two, like revisit there and applying some of your model and your thinking to that. So that was really interesting to me. Was there anything else in the new book
yeah,
that stood out for you?
yeah, this human and organizational performance.
Mm.
That chapter. Once again, I made some changes to the what is it, five points,
Five principles. Yep.
five principles. But I would just restate them such as this: instead of people make mistakes, instructors make mistakes. Errors are natural aspect of human behavior. Blame fixes nothing. Blaming students, parents, screening, etc. Instead of blaming, HOP focuses on instructor learning. The third one I didn't change. Learning and improving is vital. Organizations should actively learn from incidents to improve safety and performance. The fourth one, context drives behavior. The course environment significantly influences how students behave on course. Once again,
Mm,
the structure, presence, supervision, involvement.
mm,
We can't control them, okay, but it can influence their behavior. The structures we put in place, the presence, all those supervision involvement can influence their behaviors to make better choices. Doesn't happen all
mm,
the time. And then the third one, how instructors should actively learn from events and from everyday work to improve the opportunity, once again, for students to make positive choices of behavior. And that's that key there, the opportunity. If you become invested in the fact that this is gonna happen, we change this, we change this structure. So once again, you gotta focus back on what you can do and what you're responsible for. But don't let their behavior dictate the success of a course.
outstanding. No, I love that. And that's fun to see you engaging with not only the safety two ideas, but then the hot principles as well, and applying, this evolution in your own thinking to that. So I think that's one of the things I've always appreciated about you, Norm, is your continuous desire to learn new things and to always be improving. And for someone who was in the field as long as you were, with all those nights in the field and all those student experiences, it would have been pretty easy for you to just become formulaic and to kind of stay stuck in your ways. And as long as I've known you, you've continued to embrace and adopt new ideas and to continuously improve. And I think that's maybe why you stayed in the field as long as you did, because you were always challenging yourself to apply new concepts and get better.
The outdoor
Go ahead.
programs I've worked with, think of the learning that takes place. This is the other aspect of this when you're focusing on what you control. Uh, think of the learning that takes place as an instructor or as an instructing team. When you're intentionally and consciously thinking about ways to do things differently, which are in your control, which may allow opportunities for students to make better choices. Think of that learning that takes place. It's experiential learning, right? That's what we're doing, and that's another aspect of this way of viewing the evaluating of a successful course is the amount of learning that took place by attempting the strategies, the structures, adjusting your presence, supervision, whatever it may be, and taking that along with you into your next course. There's a lot of learning that takes place when you're focusing on what you control.
No doubt. No doubt. Wonderful. These are wonderful stories and lessons learned over your long career. I'm going to ask a difficult question that maybe we won't include in the final episode, but I'm just curious, if as you look back on your career, if there's a real sort of success story or some shining moment that really stands out for you from an experience you had on one of your courses.
Boy, there's so many. I can't think of one in particular, but keeping
Hmm.
in with what we're talking about here, I think it was when I realized that change of how to measure the success of a course. It did a lot for me. That was a big switch, you know. Why am I measuring the course on what I don't control?
Mm.
I'm not even responsible for their behavior. They're responsible for their behavior. I'm responsible for my behavior. And as a teacher, as an instructor, as a teacher, as an adult role model, as a mentor, there's a lot of responsibility that goes into that.
Mhm.
That's what I'm responsible for. And if I focus on that, then that was a big change in thinking when it came to evaluating the success of a course.
No
So we
doubt.
may we may have gotten at the end of a course and people from the outside might have heard about the challenges and situations that occurred and be, boy, that must have been a hard course, or that sounds like a pretty bad course. And well, yeah, it was challenging, but it was pretty darn successful. I learned a hell of a lot out there. It's pretty darn successful.
That's great.
You
I
know,
love it. I love it. Well, Norm, I think we might be wrapping up here, but once again, I'll just say thanks, and I continue to learn new things from you, and I really appreciate how you've embraced some of the different models and concepts in the book and applied them to your own evolution and thinking about this over your long career. And yeah, I want to thank you for all that you have taught me over the years. And any kind of final words or pieces of advice to people who are working in the field right now before we sign off?
yeah. The other thing I would say is if this resonates with you, take it with you into the field, and you may find it works really well for you in the future as you progress through the your work as an instructor.
To my guest, Norm, and to all of you for listening, remember, despite the show's title, we can be lucky and good, but relying on luck is not a risk management strategy. So let's keep sharing our stories so that we can earn our luck. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Please check the show notes and learn more about how to be a guest at Lucky or Good Podcast. Thanks for listening.